Wrongfully convicted cop begs to see his K9 one last time. What happened next shocked everyone. The cold, concrete walls of the prison cell seemed to close in on Detective Mark Jensen as he sat on the edge of his cot, staring at the faded photograph in his trembling hands. In the picture, Mark was smiling, truly smiling, with his loyal K9 partner Shadow, a sleek black German shepherd, sitting proudly by his side. It was taken on the day they were awarded a medal for saving a kidnapped child. Mark could still feel the warmth of that moment, the trust in Shadow's golden eyes, the bond that no one could break. But before we dive into what happens next, I'd love to know, where are you tuning in from today? Drop a comment below. But now everything was broken. Mark had been a decorated cop, known for his integrity and devotion to his job. Yet all it took was one false accusation, one carefully orchestrated frame-up to rip his life apart. A dirty drug bust, planted evidence, and a slew of lies had landed him in prison for a crime he didn't commit. The betrayal from within his own precinct stung almost as much as the judge's gavel slamming down, sentencing him to 15 years. He hadn't seen Shadow in over 2 years. The dog had been reassigned to another handler after Mark's conviction. The thought of his partner, his closest friend, being taken away without understanding why, made Mark's chest tighten every time he thought about it. When Mark's lawyer visited him with updates about his appeal, Mark had only one request. "Let me see Shadow. Just one more time." The lawyer sighed, hesitant. The system wasn't known for granting privileges to convicted felons, let alone ones like this. Still, she promised to try. Weeks passed with no word, and Mark had resigned himself to never seeing Shadow again. But then, on an overcast afternoon, the prison warden called him into his office. "You've got a visitor," the warden said gruffly, not meeting Mark's eyes. Mark's heart leapt. He didn't dare hope, but as he stepped into the visitation yard, he froze. Standing there, tail wagging furiously, was Shadow. Mark dropped to his knees as the German shepherd sprinted toward him, barking joyously. The dog collided with him, nearly knocking him over, and began licking his face. Mark buried his hands in Shadow's thick fur, tears streaming down his face. "Hey, buddy," he choked out, his voice breaking. "I missed you so much." Shadow whimpered softly, as if he understood the pain they'd both endured. For a moment, the world around them disappeared. It was just Mark and Shadow, like old times. The reunion was bittersweet, though. Mark knew this was only temporary. The handlers stood nearby, waiting to take Shadow back. He only had a few precious minutes. But then something unexpected happened. Shadow suddenly stiffened, his ears perking up. He began barking, not playfully but with urgency. He turned toward one of the handlers, growling low in his throat. "What's wrong with him?" one of the guards asked, startled. Mark stood up, his instincts as a cop kicking in. He followed Shadow's gaze to the handler's bag. "Open it," Mark said, his voice sharp. The handler hesitated, then shook his head. "It's just my gear." Shadow barked again, more aggressively this time, and lunged toward the bag. "Open it!" Mark roared. Reluctantly, the handler unzipped the bag, and out tumbled a small packet of white powder. The guards froze, and the warden, who had been watching from a distance, stormed over. "What the hell is this?" the warden demanded. Shadow growled again, his body positioned protectively in front of Mark. It didn't take long for the truth to come out. The handler had been part of the same corrupt network that had framed Mark. The drugs in the bag were meant to be smuggled out, but Shadow's keen senses had uncovered the operation. The revelation set off a chain of events that changed everything. An investigation was launched, and Mark's conviction was re-examined. The evidence against him unraveled, exposing the web of corruption within his precinct. Within months, Mark's name was cleared, and he was released from prison. On the day he walked out of the gates, Shadow was waiting for him, tail wagging just as it had on the day of their reunion. This time, there were no handlers, no time limits, just Mark and his partner, free to start over. Mark knelt down, pulling Shadow close. "You saved me, buddy," he whispered. "I'll never let you go again." As they walked away from the prison, side by side, Mark couldn't help but marvel at the twist of fate. What had started as a desperate plea to see his K9 partner one last time had turned into the moment that saved his life. As Mark and Shadow walked away from the prison gates, the chill of freedom swept over them, but so did the weight of what had been stolen. The road ahead was uncertain, and Mark couldn't shake the feeling that clearing his name was only the beginning. The corruption that had framed him wasn't fully dismantled, and he owed it to Shadow and himself to ensure it never happened to anyone else. Their first stop was a modest house on the outskirts of the city, where Mark's sister Lisa welcomed them with open arms. Lisa had stood by Mark through his darkest days, fighting tirelessly for his release. Shadow took an immediate liking to her, his tail wagging as she knelt to rub his ears. "It's good to have you home," Lisa said, her voice thick with emotion. Mark nodded, his hand resting on Shadow's back. "It's good to be home, but I'm not done yet." Lisa frowned, knowing what he meant. "You're going after them, aren't you?" Mark's jaw tightened. "They ruined my life, Lisa. They ruined others' lives too. I can't just walk away." Lisa sighed but didn't argue. She knew Mark well enough to understand he wouldn't rest until justice was fully served. In the weeks that followed, Mark began piecing together the puzzle of corruption that had infiltrated his precinct. With Shadow by his side, he revisited old connections, dug through case files, and reached out to trusted allies still on the force. Slowly, a clearer picture began to emerge. The handler who had smuggled the drugs was just a pawn in a much larger game, a game orchestrated by people who had no intention of being exposed. One night, as Mark sifted through a box of old case files, Shadow suddenly perked up, his ears twitching. A low growl rumbled in his throat. "What is it, boy?" Mark asked, following Shadow's gaze to the window. A shadow moved outside, and Mark's blood ran cold. Someone was watching them. Quietly, he grabbed the gun Lisa had insisted he keep for protection. Shadow stood at the ready, his muscles tense. Mark moved to the door and yanked it open, catching a glimpse of a figure darting away into the darkness. Mark and Shadow gave chase, the cool night air biting at their skin and fur. The intruder was fast, but Shadow was faster. The German Shepherd leaped, taking the person down with a precision that reminded Mark why they'd been such an effective team. "Don't move!" Mark barked, aiming his gun as he approached. The figure groaned, struggling under Shadow's weight. It was a young man, barely out of his teens. Mark recognized him as one of the rookies who had joined the force shortly before his conviction. "Please," the rookie stammered. "I wasn't trying to hurt you. I came to warn you." Mark frowned, lowering his weapon slightly. "Warn me about what?" "They know you're digging," the rookie said, his voice trembling. "The people who set you up. They're watching you. They'll come after you if you get too close." Mark's mind raced. He didn't trust the rookie completely, but the fear in his eyes seemed genuine. "Who's behind this?" Mark demanded. The rookie hesitated, glancing around as if the shadows themselves might betray him. "I don't know everyone, but it's bigger than you think. High-ranking officers, even politicians, they're all in on it, and they won't stop until you're silenced." Mark felt a chill that had nothing to do with the night air. This was bigger than he'd imagined, and the danger was real. "I can't back down," Mark said firmly. "Not now." The rookie nodded reluctantly. "Then be careful. They'll come for you, and for anyone you care about." Mark let the rookie go, watching as he disappeared into the night. When he turned back to Shadow, the dog looked up at him, his golden eyes filled with unshakable loyalty. "We've got a fight ahead of us, buddy," Mark said, scratching behind Shadow's ears. "But we'll face it together." In the weeks that followed, Mark and Shadow prepared for the storm. They moved cautiously, staying one step ahead of their enemies while continuing to uncover the truth. Lisa became an integral part of their operation, helping from behind the scenes. Eventually, their efforts led them to a warehouse on the edge of town, a hub for the illegal operations that had ensnared Mark. It was there that they made their stand. Shadow's instincts were invaluable as they navigated the dimly lit corridors. Together, they uncovered damning evidence: financial records, communication logs, and even video footage tying powerful figures to the corruption. But just as they were about to leave, the warehouse doors slammed shut and footsteps echoed around them. "You should have stayed quiet, Jensen," a familiar voice sneered. Mark turned to see his former superior, Captain Briggs, flanked by armed men. Shadow growled, positioning himself protectively in front of Mark. "I trusted you," Mark said, his voice laced with betrayal. Briggs shrugged. "Trust doesn't pay the bills, Jensen. You should have learned that by now." The standoff was tense, but Mark wasn't unprepared. He activated a signal on his phone, alerting allies he'd arranged as backup. Within minutes, sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder. Realizing they were outnumbered, Briggs and his men attempted to flee, but Shadow was relentless, taking down one of the armed guards with precision. The backup arrived just in time, arresting Briggs and his accomplices and securing the evidence Mark had found. The fallout was swift and far-reaching. The corruption scandal rocked the city, leading to numerous arrests and sweeping reforms. Mark was hailed as a hero, not just for clearing his name, but for exposing the rot that had plagued the system. Through it all, Shadow remained by his side, a constant reminder of loyalty, courage, and the unbreakable bond they shared. Together, they proved that even in the face of betrayal and danger, justice could prevail. "I trusted you," Mark said, his voice laced with betrayal. Briggs shrugged. "Trust doesn't pay the bills, Jensen. You should have learned that by now." The standoff was tense, but Mark wasn't unprepared. He activated a signal on his phone, alerting allies he'd arranged as backup. Within minutes, sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder. Realizing they were outnumbered, Briggs and his men attempted to flee, but Shadow was relentless, taking down one of the armed guards with precision. The backup arrived just in time, arresting Briggs and his accomplices and securing the evidence Mark had found. The fallout was swift and far-reaching. The corruption scandal rocked the city, leading to numerous arrests and sweeping reforms. Mark was hailed as a hero, not just for clearing his name, but for exposing the rot that had plagued the system. Through it all, Shadow remained by his side, a constant reminder of loyalty, courage, and the unbreakable bond they shared. Together, they proved that even in the face of betrayal and danger, justice could prevail.